That's a really good angle to take there, that was a pretty good commentary on that. Um, I've got a little bit of stuff about Titus. We mentioned some of this stuff, so I'll try to do the short version here. But as you mentioned, Titus was the guy that they took to the council in Jerusalem, sort of as Exhibit A, like, hey, we all know this guy's saved, and he's not circumcised. So he was like proof that, in one sense, but he was certainly taken to that council by Paul and Barnabas. And interestingly, that's also where we get the idea that Titus may have lived in Antioch, because Paul and Barnabas were sort of co-pastoring the church in Antioch, like right before Paul went on any missionary journeys, right after he got back from Arabia and confirmed his apostleship and stuff. He went with, and he was Barnabas, who was like one of the first, Christians. He was like around, he actually introduced Paul to Peter and the other apostles there to sort of confirm him. So Barnabas has been around for a while. And so this early church in Antioch is where Titus was. So Titus probably was one of the first, Christians as well, this early church that Barnabas and Paul were pastoring at. Yeah, well, basically that's pretty much all I had for that. I mean, I think that it's interesting to note that there isn't a whole bunch that we do know about Titus. You do get the impression that we're sort of a little bit bolder in that you don't hear Paul encouraging him to, stay strong and these kinds of things, whereas with Timothy, we get the idea that he may have been a little bit more timid, and that may have been, at least a slight issue, but we don't see any of that with Titus. He pretty much seems to work really well with Titus in that way, and they seem to understand each other. He kind of writes the letter in a sense that, sort of presupposes that Titus knows a great deal about how Paul operates. I think one example of that is as we get into him talking about the nature of how the pastors should be in their lives, the ones that he's asking Titus to appoint them. He says, like the ones that, like I did with you, and then he just launches right into to it without any explanation. It's they probably had sort of a really good relationship like that. So, and also notably that Titus was sent to some pretty big problem areas, as we've mentioned, to give us at least a flavor of who Titus was, this early brother in Christ. And that's all I have for that one, Mike.
All right. Titus chapter 1, verse 5. This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. Paul left Titus in Crete to, as he says, put what remained into order. That is, raise up disciples and implement a structure that could grow in the Lord, belong in God, independent of both Titus and Paul, which is minimal oversight. Titus is there to put in place elders, or as the Greek says, presbyteros. Leonidas, which is a Leonidas lexicon of the New Testament. The technical name is the Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament based on semantic domains. It's kind of the latest and greatest of Greek New Testament dictionaries. Leonidas lexicon defines an elder as a person of responsibility and authority in matters of socio-religious concerns, both in Jewish and Christian societies, i.e., an elder. It is generally assumed that these persons who are that these are persons who are strong in the faith, obviously, and are by fiat for this time older men, but much more importantly, they are godly men. That generally they're sort of men over 30 at least. But we must remember that God even raised up a woman nicknamed Honeybee, i.e. Deborah, to go do what a man named Lightning, i.e. Barak, would not. So the godly mature in the faith, is the key part. The word presbyteros. This is where we get the term Presbyterian, from which describes the style of church governance exhibited in Presbyterian denominations. It's also interesting to note that Titus is to appoint elders in every town, as I directed you. This is important to remember, and to my mind recalls the way in which independent congregations in general function. Someone feels called of God to go and start a church, or to be a pastor, or whatever, And the elders of that church community discuss it, talk about it, and then they bless him and pray over him and send him out, giving him a red cent. If God has called you to do something, he's going to provide the resources necessary to do so. And I commend it. You see that model here very clearly, I think, throughout Titus and really all of the epistolatory letters. Chris?
Cool. Yeah, when Paul was released from his first imprisonment in Rome, there was 2 imprisonments of Rome by Paul, he apparently did some mission work with Titus on the island of Crete. Congregations were established, as it says, in every town, which he says in this verse. Paul then appears to have traveled from Crete to Ephesus and then to Macedonia, as he had intended to do, which we read in Philemon 22 and Philippians 2, verse 24. When Paul left Crete, he left Titus in charge to complete the organization of the church there, to deal with the false teachers who were upsetting the faith and whole households, as we're actually going to read in the next session that we do, hopefully with a little bit of audio on both of our ends, and then to carry on the pastoral work that still needed to be done on Crete. Now, Paul left Titus with this verbal instructions that he was to carry out, one of which is we'll talk about in just a second, which is to ordain elders in every city. It does appear, as a side note, that Titus was later relieved on Crete by Artemis, or I don't know how to pronounce this name, Tychicus, and that Titus traveled to, how do you say it? Tychicus. And that Titus then traveled to Nicopolis of the Roman province of Epirus, man, these Greek words, or Roman words, I don't know, on the western coast of Greece to spend the winter with Paul. Titus also seems to have been present with Paul during a portion, at least, of his second imprisonment in Rome, which he was later killed at, before Paul sent him to the Roman province of Dalmatia, which was on the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea across from Italy. And we see that in 2 Timothy 4, verse 10. And I got a lot of that from a website called ChristianConnect.com. As I mentioned, it's important to note that one of Titus's main jobs will be to ordain elders in every city. This is significant because it was a huge job. Crete was famous for having many cities, and this was specifically he was supposed to know how to do this, and that's what Paul will get into. Really quickly, I'm going to describe some of the issues with the words there. Presbyteros, which, as you were mentioning, sort of it means elders, translated here as elder, but it can mean like a senior, or just as we kind of, it's pretty similar to what we would look at as elder. It can have sort of 2 possible meanings or more. But later he will interchange that word with bishop. This is one of the places where we see the elder, bishop, and in fact, it's the word translated as pastor, or will often be used interchangeably. The Greek for episkopos, which is bishop, means overseer or superintendent, and it's hard but try to get the modern idea of bishops out of your head. These men that Titus was asked to ordain would be, just as you mentioned, people further along in the faith that would likely be like a pastor today, probably more correctly sort of like associate pastors like Barnabas and Paul type thing, when that's not a hard fact that they were, but it's just, there's a lot of confusion on this, and there's a lot of division on this. In fact, many of the Christian denominations, as you mentioned, Presbyterians, are divided because of how they feel about church government. The only other office that seems to be completely separated from this is deacons, which in the Bible is used for like food distribution programs and a lot of the, grunt work type stuff. One of, I think, the best, now there's all kinds of places where you can take somebody and show them that the word for elder and bishop and pastor all are used interchangeably of the same thing. You can take them to a lot of verses all over the Bible which prove that. And this is one of them, actually, where Paul uses them interchangeably. But I think one of the best proofs for that is something I found on a Catholic apologist website. It's actually the official website, Catholic.com, where they have a lot of apologetic material. And I thought this was hilarious when I was reading this, because if you know anything about Catholic doctrine, they have absolutely no good reason to say that bishop and and presbyteros and all these things are the same thing. They certainly would be separated. It says, quote, "A second issue that the apologist will encounter when discussing the office of bishop concerns its historical origin with respect to the office of priest. The New Testament appears to use the terms bishop, episkopos, and priest, presbyteros, interchangeably. Acts 20, verse 17, with 20 verse 28. Titus 1, verse 5 through 7. It also speaks of there being more than one bishop in a given church, in Philemon 1, verse 1. From the end of the first century onward, there appears to have only been one bishop, and it goes on to say, essentially, when it says from the end of the first century onward, they're saying once you get outside of that pesky Bible, and I don't mean to come down on our Catholic friends, but that's essentially what they're saying there, is that, in the Bible, it doesn't look anything like what we're saying, but once you get after that first century onward, there seems to be only one bishop, and it goes on to say more. So I will end there and let you take it away.
All right, man. Good point about the episkopos presbyteros thing. I know that there's a lot of people who feel that those are two different positions, and they stick vehemently to their guns about that. I tend to go the other way. But it's not critical.
It's not. It's not critical, I don't think. But nevertheless,
people sure get angry about it. It's true.
That's a really good angle to take there, that was a pretty good commentary on that. I've got a little bit of stuff about Titus. We mentioned some of this stuff, so I'll try to do the short version here. But by Paul and Barnabas. And interestingly, that's also where we get the idea that Titus may have lived in Antioch, because Paul and Barnabas were sort of co-pastoring the church in Antioch, like right before. As you mentioned, Titus was the guy that they took to the council in Jerusalem, sort of as Exhibit A, like, hey, we all know this guy's saved, and he's not circumcised. So he was like proof that, in one sense, but he was certainly taken to that council to sort of confirm him. So Barnabas has been around for a while, and so this early church in Antioch is where Titus was. So Titus probably was one of the first, Christians as well, this early church that Barnabas and before Paul went on any missionary journeys, right after he got back from Arabia and confirmed his apostleship and stuff, he went with, and he was Barnabas, who was like one of the first, Christians. He was like around, he actually introduced Paul to Peter and the other apostles there.